What is the Antarctica? A strange land? What does it really represent to us? An unexplored area, even to this day? Or could it be a portal? A portal to another world? An inner world? In today's exploration, we'll explore the inner world, Admiral Byrd's story. Is the Antarctica really a gateway? What kind of gateway, if it is? A physical gateway to another realm? An internal gateway to an inner world? Or is it a gateway through a dimension? Richard Evelyn Byrd, Rear Admiral in the United States Navy, a hero, an Antarctic explorer, and a pioneering aviator. What is it about Richard E. Byrd that inspires us? What did he really achieve in his life? In Operation Highjump-The Saga, we looked at all the different aspects of it, and we looked at the official accounts. Yet Richard E. Byrd continues as an amazing hero. Seen here in his impeccable tie under his flight suit, he managed to cultivate a heroic personality around himself, first through his aviation exploits of reaching the North Pole, and then his explorations of Antarctica, which dominated the remnants of his career. In fact, it was his successful exploration of Antarctica in the the late 1920s, that facilitated his promotion to Rear Admiral, the youngest admiral at 41 in the history of the United States Navy. His ship that he conducted this exploration in was even featured in the Chicago World's Fair, A Century of Progress. How was it Admiral Byrd was able to achieve all these incredible feats? He even had a ticker tape parade. Admiral Byrd was well-traveled, and he had many friends with powerful, influential individuals, such as the Rockefellers, the Fords, and he was ingratiated with the command of the United States Navy. Not just anyone gets a ticker tape parade, and keep in mind this is a ticker tape parade in the early 1930s. I mean, just think on it. The Great Depression's happened, you see your friend about to jump out the window and you say, "Don't go jump out that window, Admiral Byrd's coming through, there's a ticker tape parade. If we're lucky, we might get to see him in person for an entire minute. We might be really lucky, and he'll look our way when he's giving his speech, or he's driving by in his car." Consider this, a full ticker tape parade for an Antarctic explorer, at a time when the nation was facing its Great Depression. Yet it didn't stop people from turning out in mass droves to support Admiral Byrd in numerous cities, including New York City. This wasn't the victory parade of World War II or World War I. This was an individual who had achieved an exploration's goal. Byrd and his men acclaimed by city, wildly cheered in Broadway parade. Walker bestows medals of merit. Admiral Byrd was a hero. He even called it a hero business. Even the Beatles didn't get a ticker tape parade, aside from the faux one that they did in this picture. Now, they may have received a ticker tape parade, but there were a lot of controversies about the Beatles, especially when John Lennon had the temerity to suggest that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus Christ. This didn't go over too well, and there were many people who burned the Beatles in effigy and said that they were outside the line in what John Lennon had proclaimed. Of course, John Lennon didn't have the temerity to say that the Beatles were more popular than Richard E. Byrd. He wasn't crazy. That would have sent him back to the United Kingdom in many different boxes, without a doubt. You don't badmouth Richard E. Byrd. These explorers are very famous people. Look at Captain James Cook. During the Revolutionary War, there was an order for American forces not to attack him. He was a British explorer. He bears a striking resemblance to actor Julian Glover, a.k.a. General Veers from Empire Strikes Back. I'm sure it's a coincidence. Back to Richard E. Byrd, 1888 to 1957, and when he passed away, you see that he has a very modest standard issue U.S. military headstone. But what's the real story behind Richard E. Byrd? How is he able to parlay his experiences into such success? We looked at it in Operation Highjump-The Saga, and now we're going to look at what his achievements were. In recapping our conclusions from the Highjump mission, we theorized three objectives: search and destroy for Wehrmacht remnants, the remnants of the Nazi Germany military, which we discounted because they certainly would have fought in Germany and not gone to the Antarctica. Goal 2, establish sovereign claim for the United States for resource exploitation. Yet this didn't make a lot of sense because in all the footage and in all the accounts we see, there seemed to be no provisions for even exploring for resources. Did they have the ability to detect for uranium, oil, and coal that they said was available in vast quantities in the Antarctica? So how would they know those resources were there? And then the final goal, which we believe is the most likely, search for access points to uncharted lands, inner or outer world, and evaluate a threat from those lands and their accessibility. We also refer to the Philadelphia experiment, a means to access different dimensions. However, these were all theories. We're going to look into it in more depth, though. Going back to the facts at the end of the last exploration concerning Operation Highjump, we recall that there were a vast number of unaccounted for U.S. military personnel from World War II, over 70,000. This is a very surprising fact because the United States decisively won World War II, to the point that it effectively occupied both opponent nations in Germany and Japan, and in all the lands that they fought on. So how could there be so many unaccounted for personnel? Furthermore, when we look at the World War II casualties, we see that the Axis military had a near 2-to-1 casualty advantage, and there was a vast advantage to the Axis in civilians killed. Now, of course, we'll justify this by saying that the Axis were dirty cheaters, or most of those casualties were sustained by the Soviet Union and China. None of the Western nations, the United States or the European nations, sustained such great casualties amongst their military and civilians. Yet, it's still bizarre and it's baffling at the same time. Looking at the United States Navy from World War II, we recall that Admiral Byrd had a sailing ship when he went down to his first exploration of the Antarctic in the late 1920s, and a couple planes that were attached to it. However, he would upgrade his assets considerably when he went in Operation Highjump, as he had an Essex-class United States aircraft carrier as his flagship. We refer to the Essex class because it was the most powerful and widely available U.S. aircraft carrier at the time. 24 were constructed for World War II, and it was a very effective and successful design. No other capital ship has ever been constructed in such number. And it was very survivable too. This is the USS Franklin, an aircraft carrier that had taken direct bomb attacks while it was supporting operations in the Battle of Okinawa and was only 50 miles off of Japan. It took several bomb attacks while it had fully armed aircraft on the deck and below the deck. These explosions killed over 700 sailors. The ship suffered many casualties, and yet it did not sink. Despite this horrific damage, it was able to return for emergency repairs and made it back to the United States to be refitted. No Essex carrier was ever sunk. Bottom line up front, these ships were very survivable and durable. Now, why do we make such a big deal about the Essex-class carrier? Because there was an Essex-class carrier available to Admiral Byrd as his flagship, the USS Philippine Sea. And finally, there were many Essex-class carriers available at the end of the war. And here, looking at the U.S. Navy active strength, we see that they went from 6,700 ships at the end of World War II to 1,240 ships by 1946, and by 1947 a further decrease of 842. We also look at the United States Marine Corps strength, up at 474,000 at the end of World War II, and down to 155,000 by 1946, and a further reduction by 1947. Why was there this phase delay, though, in the reductions, according to the official numbers in both ships and personnel available? We look at the roster of all the Essex-class carriers, and we find that all of them were not decommissioned until 1947. Interestingly enough, since Operation Highjump occurred from late 1946 to the first 2 months of 1947. In other words, every single one of these Essex carriers that were commissioned could have served in Operation Highjump in some way, shape, or form, or that could have acted as a reserve. Why were these ships left activated when the United States seemed to be in a great hurry to quickly demobilize its military after World War II? In the words of President Truman, they needed to go off the war footing and establish a peacetime economy. Even though it had been the war economy that had dragged the United States out of the Great Depression officially, they seemed to be in a hurry to demobilize the military. Yet all of these Essex carriers could have served in other task forces under Admiral Byrd in Operation Highjump, and we did establish that Admiral Byrd was very clearly the officer in charge. Even though there was another admiral in charge of the supporting task force, we realized there could have been other task forces available. We only have the official account in terms of what men, materials, ships were available for Operation Highjump, but there could have been many more, given the fact that there was still a large number of U.S. military personnel that were not demobilized after World War II until 1947. We also consider the story of James Forrestal, the United States Secretary of the Navy and the first Secretary of Defense. He was an effective Secretary of Defense, and he saw what he believed was corruption and poor decisions in the Truman administration, so much so that he decided to support Truman's opponent Dewey and promised to support him and serve as Secretary of Defense if Dewey defeated Truman. And while it looked like Dewey had defeated Truman in the election, the opposite had occurred and Truman won the election. Unfortunately, it was the end of James Forrestal's political career, and ultimately his life, as according to the official account, he committed suicide. There are many accounts of what the United States Navy did during World War II, including the Philadelphia experiment, which was simply a rumor, although the individual that relayed the story had recanted their account, and then they recanted the recant of their account, and then they recanted the recant of the account. Does that get a little confusing? I keep flip-flopping back and forth. Is that simply to bring about confusion, or does that seem like someone who's bowing to personal pressure, as in this was a story they were not supposed to share? The USS Eldridge, which supposedly was rendered invisible, and yet there was a horrifying mistake in the experiment which caused many sailors to lose their lives. We look at the Antarctic region, and we see how it looks today, with many bases from many different nations, and supposedly having claims that were prior to the Antarctic Treaty of 1959. We see all the different bases across the Antarctic. Of course, we don't really know exactly what the Antarctica really looks like. The map and the ability to actually look at it is classified. Yes, we have an idea of what its supposed general outer shape is, and we can see where the bases are located and what nations have control of the bases or operate the bases. It's also interesting that according to the treaty, there's to be no military presence there. Therefore, there has to be a military presence there to ensure that there is no military presence there. Are you getting the hint that I'm getting that there's a lot of contradictions with this account? What's truly going on? Why is every nation involved in basing across the Antarctica? What's the real story behind it? The United States seems to have the most bases, and it also seems to have the most access to what would be considered the South Pole, where the U.S. base Amundsen Scott is located, and the access point for McMurdo Base. It's very strange, and yet it was the United States that spearheaded the explorations of the Antarctica, under the command of Rear Admiral Richard Byrd. In fact, it was Commander Richard Byrd's explorations of the Antarctica that got him promoted, bypassing the rank of captain. What's the real story with this? This limited access, this concept of a line of latitude which defines the South Pole region, which access is very tightly controlled. Much of the speculation comes from the missing diary of Admiral Richard E. Byrd, where it's supposedly detailed that Richard E. Byrd stated that there were explorations and they found many other lands. And that's where this reference to many great resources that existed in Antarctica supposedly came from. The problem is the diary is missing. And we have a lot of innuendo, a lot of assertions that it did really exist, but we don't have the diary itself. I would like to state that even if we did have a diary, even if it was from Richard E. Byrd, and even if he did document these fantastic claims, it wouldn't necessarily prove anything. It could have just been words that he put on paper. But regardless, there have been theories that there is access to an inner world, a series of concentric spheres that exist under the surface. We'll be told by mainstream accounts that they know exactly what the world looks like, that it's a core surrounded by molten magma and lots of deep layers. It was also proven by Aaron Eckhart and Hilary Swank. Oh, wait a minute, that was just a movie. The Core. And it was not a very good movie in my humble opinion. But regardless, it did show, though, that this is what they believe. But other theories indicate that there's an inner world, lands with on the inside of a concentric sphere. Now, could this be the actual existence? Or could this simply be another way to try to explain lands that exist beyond the Antarctica? Yes, of course, we're told that we know that we're on a sphere or an obloid spheroid, but other theories indicate that it may be a crater. It may be flat. You can fly up to 40 to 60,000 feet and you won't see much curvature. Of course, you're told that you just need to go higher. I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. I can tell you what the official statement is from mainstream accounts, that it's a sphere or an obloid spheroid. Yet we see many different things. There's many different theories, and there's also the facet of what did human beings believe in the past. We'll be told by the mainstream account that they always believed that it was a sphere. That even the ancient Greeks knew it, and they were able to extrapolate an equation to give them a good idea of what the circumference of this sphere was. Yet there's other accounts that seem to indicate that even as late as the late 19th century, they had different ideas for what the true shape of the land, the realm, was. These are oftentimes difficult things to talk about, because there's a lot of high emotion associated with them, and the evidence seems to contradict itself. There's evidence for both, and there's evidence against. There's also evidence for many other theories of existence. A crater, many different aspects of concentric spheres, an inner world. There's often theories that may make sense in some respects but don't make sense in others. Yet consider the possibility of an inner world or other lands, what that would really mean for existence. Why is it there was so much effort put into going to the Antarctica? You can watch the videos with Admiral Byrd, and there's plenty of videos available where he actually speaks, and you can even listen to him speak and come to your own conclusions. He seems like a very respected military commander, a senior officer, a general grade officer, or a flag officer as they'd call him in the Navy, and yet at the same time he seems like he's a very skilled actor. His official story states that he was retired from the Navy for an ankle injury and then recalled to active service in World War I. And then once he became a heroic aviator and made his way up to the North Pole, yes, he flew to the North Pole as well, suddenly his reputation was secured and he was the only individual who could do these explorations, it seemed. In fact, the United States government didn't seem to want to go to either the Arctic or the Antarctic unless Admiral Byrd was in charge. It's a very interesting consideration. Did he find a gateway? Or did he observe something that was beyond what we saw in the official videos that just show us a bunch of penguins and sea lions and dog teams frolicking around? Yet no mention of how they found all these incredible resources that he did officially state, and you can listen to it on the video yourself, that there was oil, uranium, and other many natural resources that were available. And what's supposed to just be a completely ice-covered, flat and featureless southern pole cap. Yet there's mountains down there. Many people can see the pictures. What is really going on? Yet it seemed to be something that the nations of the world agreed upon in 1959 to rapidly implement the Antarctic Treaty, defining who had access, military limitations, and the fact that it's controlled access even to this day. Could there be links to an inner world? It's often just considered a theory. And yet these aren't new theories. There's even an author who we're told from the 18th century, although strangely enough the books that this author wrote spread around in the early 19th century, about the existence of an inner world, concentric rings under the surface of the world. Now, is that the way it really looks? Is it really a crater? We just don't know. We have so many different conflicting accounts in terms of what's even out there. What we do know for sure, though, is access to the South Pole and the Antarctica region is controlled. It is monitored by the militaries of the world, primarily by the United States military, which to this day still retains the strongest navy. And we saw how strong the United States Navy was in World War II, with nearly 7,000 ships at its disposal. And even after they disarmed at the end of World War II, many of those ships were in mothball, and they still had the personnel trained. Yet we have images of what some of these journeys from this supposed science fiction account from this 18th and 19th century story, where we see incredible life forms. Things that seem somewhat human, but are most certainly not human. Incredible and intelligent animal creatures. And we think about what we've come across in our other explorations with the Blemmies or the headless people, and many of the other creatures that we're told only existed in legend and myth. And of course, people will ridicule these accounts as just the imagination of some crazed author from distant eras past, who also seem to speculate that there were living trees that were sentient and had their own incredible civilization. It's quite a remarkable imagination that posits all these things, and yet at the same time, these were the ideas that were available, and they do seem to indicate that if these were ideas from the past, then these could have been ideas from what the old world was truly aware of, and therefore, some aspect of these other lands do exist. Now, are these other lands that you can reach physically just by traveling either outside the crater, beyond the known plane, or access through some other dimension, depending on what the real shape of the land is. It's entirely possible that it is exactly as they tell us, that it is a sphere, an obloid, spheroid, or whatever shape they want to call it. And the only access is through some sort of dimensional gate, a science that they wish to confine to isolated lands where no one can interfere. And if we consider the follow-up to the Philadelphia experiment, that could well be the reason for the controlled access to the Antarctica. But there's just so many accounts of other lands and other creatures that just don't match with what we know, with our current lands, and what we believe we know about their limitations. Going back to the United States Navy's active ship force levels, though, from 1945 to 1950, we can already tell there's a discrepancy between what's reported. Now, accordingly, these are the strength numbers at the end of each fiscal year, and the United States military ends its fiscal year with the United States government from September to October. So at the end of 1945, the United States had 6,768 ships available. Let's pay attention to the carriers, though. They had 28 fleet carriers. They had 71 escort carriers. Those were smaller carriers. But by 1946, they had already decreased to 15. But that doesn't match the numbers that we saw, the Essex carriers, many of which were not decommissioned until 1947. So there's a discrepancy right there. Finally, consider the strength of the United States Marine Corps. It still retained a good portion of its strength in 1946. And it wasn't until the end of the fiscal year in 1947, well after Operation Highjump, that they were finally allowed to decrease the force to 93,000. Why were they waiting? It was very clear that the policy of the United States after World War II was to disarm and demobilize. Here's what one of the great task forces, the Fast Carrier Attack Force, or the Third Fleet from World War II, looked like. And you see the power that the United States could project in World War II with this Fast Carrier Task Force. Now imagine if this Fast Carrier Task Force was still assembled in 1946, which what we just looked at with these Essex-class carriers, they were still available. How feasible would it have been to assemble a force that was off the books, or not reported, that supported Admiral Byrd and Operation Highjump? Now, they may not have been directly employed in the area, but they could have had a large reserve ready, and it seems almost as though the United States Navy retained its strength for that very purpose. What other reason did they stay active until 1947? Because it was only shortly after the United States Navy completely demobilized that the Soviet Union managed to outmaneuver the United States, despite the fact the Soviet Union was not a nuclear-armed nation, and impose a blockade on Berlin in East Germany. Now, supposedly the United States overcame that by the Berlin airlift, but not once did it ever threaten to escalate with a nuclear strike on the Soviet Union, which did not have nuclear arms. And they didn't test their first nuclear weapon until later, and even when they did, what combat capability did it have? It's one of those things that doesn't make any sense. It's as though the United States military had to be demobilized so that it would be completely unprepared for the Korean War. And it was caught unprepared for the Korean War, because if some semblance of the United States military remained in 1950, well, the Korean War probably would have had a very different outcome. We go back to the total missing since 1973, unaccounted for American military personnel from World War II, 73,695. How many forces can you field with that? Now, since that time, they've managed to account for 1,457, but there's still 72,238 that are unaccounted for as of today. What does this really mean? Could there really be that many remains that are spread across all the battlefields and lands that the United States did occupy or have full access to that they were unable to account for at the end of World War II? It's one of the great mysteries, and it's something that's hand-waved over, especially when we consider how strange these times were. Admiral Byrd seemed to be the only one that the United States government and the powers that be, and it's very clear that he was ingratiated with the powers behind the scenes. He was the one who was trusted to continue the explorations of the Antarctica. He was also the one who was trusted with Operation Deep Freeze that occurred in the 1950s, where the United States established its permanent bases that stay today. James Forrestal knew something. He was aware of these operations. 1946 and 1947 was a transitional year. Decisions were made that still affect us to this day. And yet it cost James Forrestal his life. And since then, the succession of Secretary of Defenses for the United States military have been, with a few rare exceptions, a long line of hacks and sycophants, the Rumsfelds, the McNamaras. And we go back to how the United States was outmaneuvered politically and militarily by the Soviet Union, even when the Soviet Union did not possess nuclear weapons, until it detonated its first test nuclear warhead. Even then, the Soviet Union didn't have the capacity to deliver nuclear weapons in a combat capability, and yet the United States just seemed perfectly content to sit back and allow the Soviet Union to develop nuclear weapons, without attempting to intervene, interdict, or threaten it in any way, shape, or form. This is extremely strange. Why and how this happened, and yet this is what the official history tells us happened. Was anybody concerned about two nuclear-armed nations causing Armageddon? It's also strange when we consider the fact that it was the United States that kept the Soviet Union fighting during World War II with logistics. The Wehrmacht, the German military, was extremely successful initially in their invasion of the Soviet Union, and had captured most of the European portions of the Soviet Union within a few short months. We're told that the Soviets managed to relocate their factories, and thanks to logistics provided by the United States, which apparently weren't interdicted by U-boats or the Imperial Japanese Navy, which did have superiority on the seas until the Battle of Midway in the summer of 1942, it's very strange. How many times has this happened where it seems as though United States policy came back to bite it in the face? And what to make of Admiral Byrd? Is he a hero? Is he a villain? Was he just a guy doing his job? He seems to have aspects of all these traits and none of them at the same time. He's an enigmatic individual. He may be a hero who knew something, and then after completing his mission, his life ended, because he served most of his life in the military and was always recalled. Or he could simply be somebody who was ingratiated with the powers that be. We just don't know. What we do know, there is something down in Antarctica that is guarded and continues to this day. Is it a gateway? Is it an access point to other lands? We don't know for sure, but we'll continue to explore. Thank you for joining me.